The Associated Press is a really interesting and long history. It is this year, in 2016, 170 years old. And it was actually founded by a bunch of New York editors to pool resources to cover the Mexican-American War. So in international news, very appropriately. And it is still today a member-owned, not-for-profit cooperative. So it's a really distinctive model of journalism that makes it basically in the not-for-profit category and not a commercial enterprise. It is also time to tell its story because, to be frank, everybody reads AP content or watches it or listens to it. They estimate up to 1 billion people around the world have access to AP News content, but nobody studies it. Most scholarship is focused on some of the bigger names, you know, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the BBC, but not necessarily a wire service. It was long assumed that all they did was, you know, sorts of the nuts and bolts. You know, there was an earthquake, there was a car accident, etc. But that's a very myopic view of the role of the wire services. And I thought it was really important to look at not so much the media that perhaps the elite consume, but what everybody who's reading foreign news everywhere, from Washington to New York to, you know, the most remote weekly newspaper somewhere out in flyover country, so to speak, might be having access to. The research is based upon oral history interviews, extended interviews, some lasting more than 5 hours, with 61 foreign correspondents that have covered virtually all continents from World War II through today. The idea started when I was working on another book, also by Cambridge, American Journalism and International Relations, and I was doing research at the AP Archives. And there, the director of corporate archives, Valerie Comer, said, oh, if you're interested in foreign news and its impact on foreign policymaking, you should talk to this correspondent. It turned out to be a 95-year-old correspondent who had covered the European theater in World War II, had perfect photographic recall of things that had happened, you know, scenes that he had witnessed more than 70 years previously. And I thought these stories are exceptionally important to tell. For one thing, you know, when you're dealing with somebody who's 95, he's now almost 100, or my oldest interviewee who turned 102 a few months ago, also covered World War II, but in the Pacific, I was very lucky that way. You have the opportunity to create a record. This is also what oral history is the possibility of creating a record where there was none, usually from people that will not necessarily leave autobiographies or papers or other forms of, you know, preserving what they have witnessed. So it's very important for me to be able to tell that part of the story, preserve this record, eventually open it up for other scholars and students who are interested to use. And it was a fascinating project that took me literally around the world. So this person I've just referred to lives on the Upper East Side in Manhattan. But it was from there to the AP Washington Bureau in DC, all the way to a country villa outside of Islamabad in Pakistan, and points in between. So I really tried to model what the foreign correspondents were doing and going straight to the source. The question of the impact of news and journalism on foreign policy and international relations is hugely debated within both the political science and the mass communication scholarship. And usually people try to figure out what the most renowned newspapers, usually, or television, either cable or network, you know, so the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, some of the, you know, CBS, the networks, what their impact has been either on forcing the hand of policymakers or on totally towing the line. And what I wanted to focus on, and that's one of the reasons why I chose the AP as well, was a deeper and, to me, stronger sense of impact. And that's the fact that by reaching a far broader section of the American public, a wire service like the AP has really the ability and, in a sense, the responsibility of painting a portrait of the rest of the world and what other countries are like and what their intentions might be like for voters across socioeconomic status, not just the elites in Washington or New York, but everywhere. And that's a really tremendous power, and I think in a sense is also a beautiful part of a journalist's mission that is informing how people will think of the rest of the world. Now, of course, I come from a constructivist theoretical background. And that's the idea that in order to form a policy, regardless of your immediate interest, you're going to base it on some sort of construct that you already have and that your voters, of course, electors already have of whatever reality might be out there. And that's where I see this really deep impact of the journalists for the AP particularly, who for, again, 170 years have been pretty much single-handedly, well, I shouldn't say that, but certainly very, very predominantly have been informing the average Joe about what's going on outside of the US borders. I think that the role of professional correspondents, whether be it for the AP or other major mainstream media, is going to grow in this era. And I certainly hope so too, because I am a little bit terrified by what I see often as a lack of the public's understanding of what goes into the creation of foreign news or even domestic news. That's one of the reasons why I decided to do this research. I really wanted to sort of peel away a layer and look at how news is put together. I don't think people realize necessarily what that entails, the nitty-gritty detail of what that entails. And so there is a sense that, my friend's selfie and, some random blogger's opinion and a news story by the AP or the Times or the BBC are all more or less on the same level of both truthfulness and impact. And I think that's a very dangerous delusion. I think that the more we're bombarded with a sort of, constant stream of information from an entire variety of sources, some legitimate, some not really, it becomes even more important, even more critical for the mainstream media to be there to sort of curate this material, to say, this is true, this is not. There is a video from the Islamic State that purports, to represent a beheading. We don't know if it's true or not, but we're going to try to do our best, A, to report on it ourselves originally, and B, to verify whether that's true or not. One point that many journalists raised with me is that a characteristic of American journalism, specifically of American journalism, is to try to find vox pop, which is kind of the Latin slang, journalistic slang for the voice of the people. You're talking to the random average person, writing about an ordinary person as opposed to the power brokers and the elites. And it used to be that, you had to really go out there and report and find it. And now it is pushed towards the journalists. There's a constant, they have to monitor Twitter and Facebook and all of that. So it is a part of the journalistic input. But then again, it has to be verified, curated, ethically handled. And that really is a role for the professionals, again, whether they're with AP or other major mainstream organizations. So I think that if we can tell the story of how news is put together professionally, ethically, according to standards and values, then maybe it will help readers who might not have that experience personally to distinguish between the kind of, random ranting that there is so much of, again, on social media, on the internet, and the valuable information that also transpires on it, on digital and social media.